Hi everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about a problem that should help you with question number 8 on exam 2. So this problem, you're going to be correcting code that you're given. And to correct the code, obviously you have to understand what's happening and what the code is supposed to do, right? So right now you have a function, count punctuation symbols, that you give it a string, and you're supposed to say how many punctuation symbols are in that string S, which is the input. And here we're just counting punctuation symbols of periods, question marks, and exclamation points. So let's take this code. We could copy and paste this code, just this part, and we could try running it to see what happens. We could also try tracing it on our own first, figuring out what should happen. But I'll just run it first here and then show you what's going on. So basically over here, we have a situation where we're starting with an accumulator of, and we're not providing any input here. So when you do that, what it's going to do is it's going to start the accumulator at the first item in the array that you're repeating for every item and show steps for, right? So it starts at 0 here because we have range 0, right? But here's a situation there where the item, rather than starting at the first item in your list, 0, if you don't give it an accumulator, the accumulator starts at your first item in your list, and or the one at index 0, and the next one starts at index 1, right? Here the indices actually correspond to the items themselves, right? So you have the list where at index 0 you have 0, at index 1 you have 1, at index 2 you have 2, etc. Okay, but the main point I want to bring out is regardless of what this list is, the accumulator, when you don't give it one, is going to start up with the 0th element of the list, and the item is going to start at the one at index 1, right? So the one right after it. Okay, so what you notice here is that the accumulator keeps going up by 1. And something you'll also notice here maybe is that the accumulator is always the item from the previous row, right? And if we go and adjust this a little, I don't have this all on the screen. Maybe I should just zoom out here. Okay, so if we do this here and go all the way to the end, you get 37, right? Which is, again, the last item that you see here. So one of the things here is that it's going to, maybe what you sort of notice is it's always, as I said, returning the item from the previous row. So basically, when you have an accumulator and an item, it's just returning that item. Now, if you look at what it's repeating here, we have an if and an else, and it's either going to return index plus 1 or index. Now, since it's always index, right, because remember, when you look at a given row, to get the next accumulator over here, like accumulator will be 0, index will be 1, that's what initially it is. So it plugs in index of 0 here, and then index of 0 here, index of 0 here. You notice that since it's actually returning 1 as the next accumulator here, so it's literally returning the index, right? Index plus 1 would be 2. You notice then that it's never, the condition in this if statement is never true. Because if it were true, like over here, index plus 1, it would return 1 plus 1, right? It should return 2, so the new accumulator should be 2. So it's always going to this else statement. So to figure out why it's doing that, you say, well, what is this condition? Why is this always false? Well, if you look carefully, you'll notice that it's saying that the item at that index, that's good. We want the item in that array is either a period, a question mark, an exclamation point, but what it's separated with is ands. right? So in order for an and to be true, it means that both of your conditions have to be true, right? And you have two ands here. It means all three have to be true. So let's say it is a period. Well, it's certainly not also going to be a question mark, right? And if it's not a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, that would be fine. We would want to return, not index, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but we would want to not count it, right? So the way to fix this is that these should all be ors, right? If we're counting the punctuation symbols, we want a period or a question mark or an exclamation point, right? Because it's impossible for a character to simultaneously be a period, a question mark, and an exclamation point. But it's certainly possible that it's one of them, right? So remember that an or statement is true as long as at least one of these is true. So if it's a period, if s of 0 is a period, if s of 0 is a question mark, if s of 0 is an exclamation point, the next time index will be 1. If s of 1 is a period, question mark, exclamation point, if any of these are true, then we're going to bump up what should be a count by 1. Otherwise, we will keep that same accumulator. So that actually gives you the next idea of the problem to fix. But you could see here now that we don't get the same column for the accumulator, unsurprisingly. So now this time, when we have a 0 accumulator and an item of 1, right, it's checking if s of 1 is a period. It's not. S of 1 is a question mark. Remember, s of 1 is going to be for this input. S is this whole string. So s of 0 is that first exclamation point, and s of 1 is that second exclamation point. And so then you see, yeah, okay, s of 1 is, an exclamation point is an exclamation point, so it's going to return index plus 1. And we can see index right now is 1, so that's going up to 2. Right? Whereas the next time it checks, when ACC is 2 and index is 2, it's going to be checking the second character, which is the D, and the D is not an exclamation point, so it's just going to return index, right? So you see in that next row, it's just returning the item itself. Okay, but as I said, we don't want to return the index, right? Because you see as you keep going, or index plus 1, because you see as you keep going down, you're either going to, the accumulator is either going to be what was I going to say, the index from the previous row, right? Or it's going to be the index of the current row, right? So if you add 1 to the item and make that your next accumulator, well, since the item is going up by 1, since you're going to that next item in the array, so if the accumulator and the item are both going up by 1, then they're going to match, right? Okay, so what I'm basically saying here is that we don't want index, right? We want to, like, when we see a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, this goes to one of the previous problems we discussed. We want to actually use our accumulator to keep track of how many of these punctuation symbols we've seen. So every single time we see a punctuation symbol, we don't take the current position that we're at and add 1 to get the next accumulator, which represents the count. We should take the accumulator, right, which is the current count, and bump it up by 1, right? So we change index plus 1 to ACC plus 1, and index to ACC, because that's our count, right? So this basically looks right. I mean, we do want to go through every character in the string. So this will go range 0, s dot length, remember it stops 1 before, so 0 to s dot length minus 1. It's going through the position of every character. And notice I'm not checking that index is equal to the period or index is equal to question mark, right? Index is going to be the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So I want to make sure I'm checking the character at that index. That's a very important point here. So over here I'm checking s of 0 and then s of 1 and then s of 2, right? Which are going to be the 0th symbol and then the first symbol and then the second symbol, the first character, 0th character, then the first character, then the second character, etc. Okay, Now if I run this one more time, well, I'll run it again, but if I run this now, things are working a lot better. We could see that when we have a punctuation symbol, like we're starting here, remember the accumulator starts at 0, the item is going to start at 1, right? And things look better. We're saying, oh, is S of 1 a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point? Right now our count is 0. S of 1 is that exclamation point, so the accumulator is being bumped up by 1. This is not the previous item this time. It's just because the accumulator was 0, now it's 1. And then we look at the next one, right? So we have 1 in this array, and then we look at 2 in the array. So now the accumulator is 1 and the index is 2, right? And it's asking, is S of 2 a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, right? So that's that D. And it's not, so it keeps the count the same. So it's using that accumulator of 1, and that's our next accumulator, right? And then it's asking, is 3 the one at character 3, because now you have your accumulator is 1, and your item goes to the next one in the list, which is 3, so 1, 3 here. So it's saying, is S of 3 a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point? And that's your I, and it's not, right? So we return ACC, which is still 1, right? And we keep going like this. Eventually we get to where the accumulator is 1 and index is 7, right? And it's checking is S of 7 one of these, and you can see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a period, so it should bump up the accumulator by 1, and it does. In that next row, you have 2 for your accumulator, and the item goes to the next